Dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. This famous quote from Freud takes on new meaning when we explore Carl Jung's revolutionary approach to dreams, particularly the transformative potential of what many consider their most disturbing aspect, nightmares. Have you ever awakened from a nightmare with your heart racing, a sense of dread lingering as you orient yourself back to waking reality? Perhaps you've experienced recurring nightmares that haunt you for years, or dreams so disturbing that you actively avoid thinking about them. Most of us have been taught to dismiss these experiences, to shake them off, remind ourselves it was just a dream, and move on with our day. But what if these nightmares, rather than being random neural firings or manifestations of fear to be avoided, are actually precious messages from the depths of your psyche? What if the very dreams that disturb you most contain exactly the psychological material you need for your next stage of growth? What if nightmares, properly understood and worked with, could become a source of profound healing and transformation? This was Carl Jung's revolutionary insight that our most disturbing dreams are not meaningless torments, but purposeful communications from the unconscious, containing symbolic material that the conscious mind needs for psychological development and spiritual growth. Jung developed specific methods for working with these dreams, approaches that combine psychological insight with alchemical symbolism to transform nightmare content into what he called spiritual gold. I remember working with a client, let's call him Robert, who had suffered from the same recurring nightmare for over 20 years. In the dream, he was trapped in a house with an evil presence hunting him. No matter which room he hid in or how he tried to escape, the malevolent entity would find him. He would wake just as it was about to attack, drenched in sweat and filled with dread that sometimes lasted for days. I've tried everything, he told me. Sleep medications, therapy focused on trauma, even avoiding sleep when I sense the nightmare might come. Nothing helps. This thing has been haunting me for half my life. What Robert didn't realize, what most of us don't understand about our disturbing dreams, is that the very persistence of this nightmare pointed to its importance. The psyche doesn't waste energy repeating meaningless torments. When a dream recurs with such intensity over years or decades, it's because it contains psychological material that is essential for our development, material that we've been unable or unwilling to integrate into conscious awareness. In the next few minutes, I'm going to reveal Jung's forgotten method for transforming nightmares into sources of healing and growth. I'll explain why your most disturbing dreams are actually invitations to wholeness, how the alchemical tradition provides a framework for understanding dream transformation, and most importantly, how you can apply these insights to your own nightmare experiences. By the end of this video, you'll understand that the dreams that have been tormenting you may actually contain exactly the medicine your soul needs for its next stage of evolution. To understand Jung's approach to nightmares, we first need to understand his view of dreams in general. Unlike Freud, who saw dreams primarily as disguised expressions of repressed desires, Jung viewed dreams as natural communications from the unconscious, messages in symbolic language that serve the psyche's inherent movement toward wholeness and integration. Jung wrote, "Dreams are neither deliberate nor arbitrary fabrications. They are natural phenomena which are nothing other than what they pretend to be. They do not deceive, they do not lie. They do not distort or disguise. They are invariably seeking to express something that the ego does not know and does not understand." This perspective fundamentally changes how we approach dreams, particularly disturbing ones. If dreams are not deceptions or meaningless neural activity, but communications serving psychological development, then nightmares are not simply manifestations of fear to be avoided, but urgent messages that demand our attention precisely because of their emotional intensity. Jung observed that dreams often compensate for conscious attitudes, presenting material that balances or completes what is one-sided or missing in our waking perspective. When the conscious attitude is significantly out of balance with the needs of the whole psyche, the compensatory function of dreams becomes more intense, sometimes manifesting as nightmares that cannot be ignored. This compensatory function explains why people who maintain rigid conscious attitudes often experience particularly disturbing dreams. The greater the imbalance between conscious orientation and unconscious needs, the more powerful the compensatory dreams become, sometimes escalating to nightmare intensity to break through conscious resistance. A woman I worked with, let's call her Catherine, prided herself on being completely rational, in control and independent. She dismissed emotions as weakness and maintained rigid boundaries in all relationships. Her nightmares featured overwhelming floods, wild animals breaking into her home, and being swallowed by the earth, all symbolic representations of the emotional and instinctual energies she had banished from conscious awareness, but that were essential for her psychological wholeness. These nightmares weren't punishments or random torments. They were the psyche's attempt to bring excluded but necessary elements into relationship with consciousness. They represented not a problem, but the beginning of a solution, the psyche's effort to restore balance and wholeness by bringing attention to what had been rejected or neglected. Jung's approach to nightmares was revolutionary because he recognized their potential value rather than seeing them simply as symptoms to be eliminated. He understood that nightmares often contain shadow material, aspects of ourselves that we've rejected, denied, or never developed, presented in symbolic form that can be disturbing precisely because it contradicts our conscious self-image. The shadow in Jungian psychology isn't simply negative qualities, but any aspects of the self that have been excluded from conscious identity. These might include socially unacceptable impulses like anger or sexuality, but also positive qualities like creativity, power, or vulnerability that have been rejected based on family or cultural conditioning. When shadow material appears in dreams, it often takes forms that the conscious mind finds threatening or disturbing. Monsters, attackers, natural disasters, or other frightening images that represent disowned aspects of the self-seeking integration. The emotional intensity of nightmares reflects both the energy contained in these disowned aspects and the resistance of the conscious mind to acknowledging them. Robert's recurring nightmare of being hunted in a house provides a perfect example of shadow material seeking integration. Through our work together, he came to understand that the evil presence hunting him represented his own repressed anger, an emotion he had been taught from childhood was dangerous and unacceptable. The house symbolized his own psyche, with the nightmare revealing that no matter where he tried to hide from this emotion within himself, it would eventually find him. This interpretation wasn't immediately comfortable for Robert, who had built an identity around being nice and never expressing anger. But the persistence of the nightmare over decades suggested that integrating this disowned aspect was essential for his psychological health. His conscious rejection of anger hadn't eliminated it, but had pushed it into the unconscious, where it gained power and autonomy, appearing in dreams as a separate and threatening entity. The alchemical dimension of Jung's approach to nightmares adds another layer of understanding and transformation. Jung was deeply influenced by his study of alchemy, recognizing in its symbolic processes a projection of psychological transformation. He saw that the alchemical opus, the great work of transforming base metals into gold, paralleled the psychological process of transforming unconscious content into integrated consciousness. In alchemical terms, nightmares often represent what was called the nigredo, or blackening stage, a phase of decomposition, darkness, and confrontation, with the shadow that precedes transformation. This stage was considered essential in the alchemical process, just as confronting shadow material is essential in psychological development. The alchemists had a saying, "In stercor invenitur, in the filth it will be found." This referred to the paradoxical truth that the material needed for the creation of the philosopher's stone was found in the most rejected and despised substances. Psychologically, this suggests that our most disturbing dreams, the ones we most want to reject or forget, often contain precisely the elements needed for our transformation and wholeness. Jung wrote, "The alchemist saw the union of opposites under the symbol of the tree, and it is therefore not surprising that the unconscious of present-day man, who no longer feels at home in his world, and can base his existence neither on the past that is no more, nor on the future that is yet to be, should hark back to the symbol of the cosmic tree rooted in this world and growing up to heaven. the tree that is also man. This tree symbolism appears frequently in dreams, often in disturbing forms. Trees that are dying, burning, or uprooted. These images represent the connection between conscious and unconscious being damaged or threatened, requiring attention and restoration. Other alchemical symbols common in nightmares include drowning, immersion in the unconscious, being pursued, aspects of self-seeking integration, or buildings collapsing, breakdown of conscious structures that no longer serve psychological growth. Understanding the alchemical dimension of nightmares helps us approach them not as problems to eliminate, but as processes to engage with, stages in a larger transformation that requires our conscious participation. Just as the alchemist didn't try to skip the Negredo stage, but worked with its dark materials, we don't try to eliminate nightmares, but learn to work with their disturbing content as raw material for psychological growth. This alchemical perspective transforms how we understand recurring nightmares. Rather than seeing them as failures of treatment or signs of hopeless psychological problems, we can recognize them as persistent invitations to engage with material that remains unintegrated. Their recurrence doesn't indicate failure, but the psyche's continued effort to bring important content into relationship with consciousness. A man I worked with, let's call him James, had recurring nightmares of drowning after his father's death. Traditional approaches focused on reducing these nightmares through relaxation techniques and medication. But from an alchemical perspective, these dreams weren't simply symptoms to eliminate. They were symbolic communications about James's relationship with the emotional depths he had always avoided, depths that his father's death had made impossible to ignore. Rather than trying to stop the drowning dreams, we worked with them alchemically, exploring the symbolic meaning of water in his psyche, the experience of surrendering control, and the transformation that becomes possible when one stops fighting against immersion in the unconscious. Over time, the dreams transformed, not through techniques aimed at eliminating them, but through conscious engagement with their symbolic content. The transformative potential of nightmares becomes clearer when we understand what Jung called the transcendent function, the psyche's capacity to create new third positions that transcend seemingly irreconcilable opposites. Nightmares often present these opposites in their most extreme form, creating the psychological tension necessary for transcendence and new integration. When we work with nightmare content rather than avoiding it, we activate this transcendent function. The conscious engagement with disturbing dream material creates the conditions for a new psychological position to emerge, one that integrates aspects of both consciousness and the unconscious in a higher synthesis. This explains why some of the most profound psychological transformations begin with periods of intense nightmares. The nightmares aren't obstacles to healing, but part of the healing process itself. The psyche's attempt to create sufficient tension for transcendence and integration to occur. A woman I worked with, let's call her Eleanor, experienced terrifying nightmares during a major life transition. She dreamed of being trapped in burning buildings, pursued by shadowy figures, and lost in labyrinthine structures with no exit. Rather than seeing these as symptoms of anxiety to be eliminated, we approach them as symbolic representations of her psychological process, the breakdown of old structures, the emergence of previously hidden aspects of self, and the disorientation that precedes new integration. As Elena engaged with these nightmares through the methods I'll describe, shortly they gradually transformed. The burning buildings became controlled fires of purification. The pursuing figures became guides once she turned to face them. The labyrinths revealed central chambers containing unexpected treasures. This transformation wasn't achieved by eliminating the nightmares, but by engaging with them as meaningful communications in the language of symbol and metaphor. The archetypal dimension of nightmares adds another layer to Jung's approach. He recognized that many disturbing dreams tap into universal patterns or archetypes from the collective unconscious, patterns that transcend individual experience and connect to shared human psychological structures. When archetypal content appears in nightmares, it often has a numinous or uncanny quality, a sense that something larger than personal experience is being encountered. These dreams may feature mythological figures, supernatural elements, or scenarios that feel ancient and significant beyond personal history. Understanding the archetypal dimension helps explain why certain nightmare themes appear across cultures and throughout history: being chased, falling, being trapped, encountering monsters, or experiencing death. These aren't simply reflections of personal fears, but engagements with universal human experiences and developmental challenges. A young man I worked with, let's call him Marcus, had recurring nightmares of being judged by a tribunal of shadowy figures who found him wanting. This dream reflected not just his personal insecurities, but an encounter with what Jung would call the archetypal judge or critical father, a universal pattern of evaluation and authority that every individual must come to terms with in the process of developing authentic selfhood. Recognizing the archetypal dimension of his nightmare helped Marcus understand that he was wrestling not just with personal fears, but with a universal human challenge: the confrontation with judgment and authority in the development of individual identity. This recognition gave the nightmare a different meaning and opened possibilities for working with it as part of a larger developmental process rather than simply a personal torment. The spiritual dimension of nightmares was particularly important in Jung's approach. Unlike many modern psychological perspectives that treat dreams as purely psychological phenomena, Jung recognized their potential spiritual significance, their capacity to connect us with what he called the self, with a capital S, the tied organizing center and totality of the psyche that transcends and includes the ego. Jung wrote, "The dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, opening into that cosmic night, which was psyche long before there was any ego consciousness, and which will remain psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness extends." This perspective sees nightmares not just as communications about psychological integration, but potentially as encounters with the transcendent dimension of human experience. The most disturbing dreams sometimes represent what religious traditions have called dark nights of the soul, periods of spiritual crisis and transformation that precede new levels of consciousness and connection. A woman I worked with, let's call her Sarah, experienced nightmares of cosmic dissolution, the stars going out, the world ending, her body disintegrating into particles. From a purely psychological perspective, these might be interpreted simply as anxiety dreams, but their numinous quality and cosmic scale suggested something more, what Jung might recognize as an encounter with the self that transcends individual identity, a confrontation with the vastness that both includes and exceeds personal existence. As Sarah worked with these dreams, they revealed themselves not as symptoms to be eliminated, but as initiatory experiences, confrontations with ultimate questions of existence and meaning that were essential to her spiritual development. The nightmares weren't preventing her growth, but were actually the growing edge of her consciousness, challenging her limited self-concept and opening her to larger dimensions of being. So how do we actually work with nightmares using Jung's approach? The process begins with recording and honoring the dream exactly as it appears, without immediately trying to interpret or change it. This means writing down the nightmare in as much detail as possible, noting emotional responses, sensory experiences, and any unusual or striking elements. This recording process itself begins to change our relationship with the nightmare, moving from fear and avoidance to curiosity and engagement. Rather than trying to forget the disturbing dream as quickly as possible, we deliberately remember it, giving it attention and respect as a meaningful communication rather than a random torment. A crucial aspect of this initial approach is adopting what Jung called the symbolic attitude, recognizing that the nightmare's elements are not literal but symbolic, carrying meanings that may not be immediately obvious. This shift in perspective, from literal to symbolic understanding, immediately changes our relationship with disturbing dream content. For example, being chased in a dream, when approached symbolically, becomes not just a frightening experience, but a question. What aspect of myself am I running from? What is pursuing me that needs my attention? Death in a dream becomes not just a terrifying end, but a symbolic transformation. What needs to die in my life to make way for new growth? This Symbolic attitude doesn't deny the emotional impact of nightmares, but places it in a larger context of meaning and purpose. The fear, horror, or dread experienced in the nightmare becomes not just a negative to eliminate, but data about the psychological importance of the content being presented, an indication of its energy and significance for the whole psyche. After recording the nightmare and adopting a symbolic attitude toward it, Jung's approach involves several specific methods for engaging with its content. One of the most powerful is what he called active imagination, a waking engagement with dream images that allows them to develop and transform through conscious relationship. In active imagination, you return to a significant image or scene from the nightmare while awake, allowing it to become vivid in your imagination. Rather than passively re-experiencing the dream, you actively engage with it, asking questions of dream figures, exploring dream environments further, or continuing the dream narrative beyond its original ending. This engagement often reveals surprising developments. Monsters may transform when confronted rather than fled from. Pursuing figures may reveal themselves as guides when asked what they want. Collapsing structures may reveal new spaces previously hidden. The key is maintaining conscious awareness, while allowing the unconscious to continue its communication through the evolving imagery. Robert, the client with the recurring nightmare of being hunted in a house, used active imagination to transform his dream. Rather than ending the dream at the point of terror where he usually woke up, he imagined turning to face the pursuing presence and asking, "Who are you? And what do you want from me?" To his surprise, the frightening figure transformed into a powerful version of himself, one capable of expressing the anger he had always repressed. This encounter began a dialogue between his conscious self and this disowned aspect, gradually leading to integration rather than continued fear and avoidance. Another powerful method in Jung's approach is amplification, connecting personal dream images to their wider cultural, mythological, and archetypal contexts. This process helps reveal the larger significance of nightmare elements and places individual experience within universal human patterns. For example, if you dream of being devoured by a monster, amplification might explore devouring monsters across mythologies, from Jonah and the whale to fairy tales like Little Red Riding Hood to the Greek myth of Kronos eating his children. These connections reveal different dimensions of what being devoured might symbolize psychologically, from necessary withdrawal from the world to destructive regression to transformative initiation. This amplification doesn't replace personal associations but enriches them, helping us recognize how our individual nightmares connect to universal human experiences and developmental challenges. It helps us see that we're not alone in our psychological struggles, but participating in patterns that have been part of human experience throughout history. A woman I worked with, let's call her Maya, had recurring nightmares of being buried, alive. Through amplification, we connected this image to various mythological and religious traditions, from Egyptian burial practices to initiation rituals involving symbolic death, to the alchemical concept of mortificatio, the necessary death of the old self before transformation. These connections helped Maya understand her nightmare not just as a personal fear, but as an engagement with the universal human experience of ego death and rebirth in psychological development. Drawing the nightmare represents another powerful method in Jung's approach. By creating a visual representation of the disturbing dream, we externalize its content, creating some psychological distance while still engaging with it directly. This drawing doesn't need to be artistically sophisticated. Simple shapes, colors, and forms can effectively capture the emotional and symbolic essence of the dream. The act of drawing often reveals aspects of the nightmare that weren't consciously noticed, details of setting, relationships between elements, or emotional qualities expressed through color and form. It also begins the process of transformation by bringing unconscious content into visible, tangible form, where it can be worked with more directly. After creating the drawing, Jung's approach involves staying with the image, continuing to engage with it through further drawing, writing, or imagination. This ongoing relationship with the externalized nightmare content allows it to evolve and transform through conscious attention rather than remaining fixed in its original disturbing form. A man I worked with, let's call him Daniel, had nightmares of being trapped in a dark cave with something threatening nearby. He drew this scene with black and deep blue colors, the cave entrance appearing as a small distant point of light. As he stayed with this image over several days, adding to it and allowing it to evolve, he found himself drawing the threatening presence more clearly, revealing it as a bear-like figure that gradually transformed from menacing to protective. As he continued engaging with the image, this visual dialogue with the nightmare transformed Daniel's relationship with it. What had been purely threatening became a potential source of strength and protection once engaged with directly rather than avoided. The cave itself expanded in subsequent drawings, revealing hidden chambers and resources that weren't apparent. In the original nightmare, embodying the nightmare through movement or voice work provides another avenue for transformation in Jung's approach. This involves physically expressing elements of the disturbing dream, moving like the pursuing figure, giving voice to the monster, or physically exploring the sensations associated with dream experiences like falling, drowning, or being trapped. This embodiment creates a bridge between the symbolic content of the nightmare and direct physical experience, allowing unconscious material to be integrated not just intellectually, but somatically. It recognizes that psychological content isn't just mental, but is experienced and expressed through the body as well. A woman I worked with, let's call her Layla, had nightmares of a dark feminine figure with distorted features who would scream wordlessly. Rather than just analyzing this figure intellectually, Layla worked with embodying the scream, giving physical voice to what had been a purely frightening dream experience. This embodiment revealed the rage and grief that the figure represented. Emotions, Layla had been taught, were unacceptable for women to express directly. As she continued working with vocal expression of these emotions, the nightmare figure gradually transformed, becoming less distorted and frightening, eventually appearing as a powerful feminine presence, offering guidance rather than terror. The embodiment process had allowed integration of the emotional energies that the nightmare figure represented, transforming their expression from frightening to empowering. Dialoguing with nightmare figures represents one of the most direct methods in Jung's approach. This involves writing or speaking an imaginal conversation with the disturbing elements of the dream, asking questions, and allowing answers to emerge without conscious planning or control. This dialogue often reveals surprising aspects of nightmare figures, their purposes, needs, or messages that weren't apparent in the original frightening encounter. What seemed purely malevolent may reveal protective functions. What appeared as attack may be revealed as desperate attempts at communication. What felt like random torment may show itself as purposeful challenge or initiation. The key to effective dialogue is maintaining both conscious awareness and openness to the unconscious, neither imposing conscious interpretations nor becoming overwhelmed by unconscious content. This balance creates the conditions for genuine communication between different aspects of the psyche, allowing integration rather than continued split and projection. A man I worked with, let's call him William, had recurring nightmares of a bull-like creature charging him. Through written dialogue with this figure, he discovered that it represented his own suppressed vitality and power, aspects of himself he had learned to fear and reject due to childhood experiences where his energy had been punished as disruptive or dangerous. The dialogue revealed that the bull wasn't charging to destroy him, but to reconnect him with his own life force and power. As William continued this communication, his relationship with the dream figure transformed, and the nightmares changed, the bull becoming a source of energy and strength rather than a terrifying threat. Creating rituals with nightmare content offers another powerful avenue for transformation in Jung's approach. This involves developing symbolic actions that acknowledge and work with the nightmare's emotional and symbolic significance, creating external expressions of the internal process of integration and transformation. These rituals might involve creating and then transforming representations of nightmare figures, enacting symbolic journeys related to dream narratives, or developing personal ceremonies that honor the nightmare's significance while supporting its transformation. The key is that the ritual has personal meaning and engages both conscious intention and symbolic expression. A woman I worked with, let's call her Nadia, had nightmares of drowning in dark water. She created a ritual that involved filling a dark bowl with water, speaking her fears into it, then gradually adding elements that transformed the water: salt for purification, a candle reflected on its surface for light in darkness, and finally, blue coloring and stones that transformed the threatening dark water into a representation of depth and wisdom rather than danger. This ritual, repeated over time with variations, helped Nadia develop a new relationship with the symbolic water of her unconscious, seeing it as a source of depth and wisdom to be respected, rather than just a dangerous element that threatened to overwhelm her. The nightmares gradually transformed, with water becoming a more positive presence in her dreams. The alchemical dimension of Jung's approach involves consciously working with nightmare content as prima materia, the raw material for psychological transformation. This means recognizing that the most disturbing elements of dreams aren't mistakes or random torments, but precisely the psychological material needed for the next stage of development. In practical terms, this involves asking, what in this nightmare needs to be transformed rather than eliminated? What opposites or conflicts does it present that might be integrated in a new synthesis? What qualities or energies appear in negative form that might be reclaimed in more constructive expression? This alchemical perspective sees nightmares as presenting psychological material in its initial, unrefined state. Material that requires conscious engagement to transform from lead into gold, from disturbing symptom into integrated strength. The goal isn't to get rid of this material, but to work with it as part of the larger opus of psychological development. A man I worked with, let's call him Thomas, had nightmares featuring a dark alchemist figure creating toxic substances in a laboratory. Rather than simply trying to eliminate this disturbing image, we worked with it alchemically, exploring what transformation this figure might be attempting, what toxic elements in Thomas's life needed processing and integration, and how the alchemical operations in the dream might reflect psychological processes trying to occur in his waking life. This approach gradually revealed that the dark alchemist represented Thomas's own capacity for psychological transformation, working with difficult emotions and experiences that his conscious attitude had rejected as toxic, but that contained essential elements for his development. As he engaged with this figure alchemically, the nightmares transformed, the laboratory becoming less threatening and the processes occurring there more clearly revealed as necessary transformations rather than threatening manipulations. As you work with nightmares using these methods, you may notice several patterns of transformation. First, recurring nightmares often change in frequency and intensity, not necessarily disappearing immediately, but becoming less overwhelming and occurring less often as their content begins to be integrated. Second, the emotional tone of disturbing. Dreams often shifts, fear, horror, or dread giving way to curiosity, respect, or even relationship with what had been purely threatening. This emotional transformation reflects changing psychological relationship with the content the nightmare represents. Third, specific imagery often transforms, pursuing figures becoming guides when faced, threatening animals revealing protective aspects, collapsing structures making way for new construction. These image transformations reflect psychological integration, occurring through conscious engagement with previously rejected material. Fourth, new dream figures or elements often appear, mediating presences that help navigate what had been overwhelming, resources that weren't available in the original nightmare, or integrative symbols that represent new psychological wholeness emerging from the engagement with difficult material. These transformations don't typically happen all at once, but unfold gradually through continued conscious relationship with the nightmare content. The process isn't about forcing change, but about creating conditions where natural psychological integration can occur, where what has been split off or rejected can be brought into relationship with consciousness. Let's return to Robert, the client I mentioned at the beginning who had suffered from the same recurring nightmare for over 20 years. Through the methods we've discussed, recording the dream, active imagination, dialogue with the pursuing figure, and embodiment work, Robert's relationship with his nightmare fundamentally changed. The pursuing presence that had terrified him for decades revealed itself as his own disowned anger, an emotion he had been taught was dangerous and unacceptable, but that contained essential energy and boundary-setting capacity he needed for psychological health. As he developed a conscious relationship with this anger, learning to express it appropriately rather than fearing and repressing it, the nightmare transformed. In later dreams, the pursuing figure became a guide rather than a threat. Still, powerful but now offering protection and strength rather than inspiring terror. The house where he had felt trapped expanded, revealing new rooms and resources. And most significantly, Robert no longer experienced the overwhelming dread that had characterized his response to the nightmare for 20 years. "It's not that I never dream of that figure anymore," he told me, "but now when it appears, I feel curious rather than terrified. Sometimes I even welcome it, knowing it brings energy and strength I need. The nightmare hasn't just disappeared, it's transformed into something valuable." This transformation illustrates the heart of Jung's approach to nightmares, not eliminating them through suppression or control, but engaging with them as meaningful communications that can transform through conscious relationship. The goal isn't to stop dreaming difficult dreams, but to develop a different relationship with their content, one of integration rather than fear and avoidance. As we conclude, I want to offer some final reflections on the gift hidden within nightmares. Jung believed that what we experience as most disturbing in dreams often contains precisely what we most need for psychological wholeness, the rejected, neglected, or undeveloped aspects of ourselves seeking integration through the symbolic language of dreams. This perspective transforms how we understand even the most frightening dream experiences. The monster pursuing you may represent disowned power seeking expression. The building collapsing around you may reflect necessary breakdown of rigid psychological structures before new growth can occur. The death you experience in dreams may symbolize the necessary ending of old patterns or identities to make way for new development. When approached with this understanding, nightmares become not just problems to solve, but invitations to greater wholeness, communications from the depths of the psyche offering exactly the material needed for the next stage of psychological and spiritual development. Their disturbing quality reflects not random torment, but the significant energy contained in these communications and the importance of their integration for psychological health. In practical terms, this means approaching your nightmares with a fundamentally different attitude, not as enemies to defeat, but as messengers to engage with, not as meaningless suffering, but as purposeful communication, not as random neural firings, but as symbolic expressions of the psyche's movement toward wholeness. This doesn't mean nightmares are pleasant or that their disturbing emotional impact isn't real. The fear, horror, or dread experienced in nightmares is genuine and significant, reflecting the psychological importance of what's being encountered. But understanding these emotions as responses to meaningful content rather than random torment transforms how we relate to them and what becomes possible through engaging with them. As Jung wrote, the dream is a little hidden door in the innermost and most secret recesses of the soul, opening into that cosmic night which was psyche long, before there was any ego consciousness, and which will remain psyche no matter how far our ego consciousness extends. This hidden door, even when it opens onto initially frightening landscapes, offers access to psychological resources and potentials beyond what the conscious mind alone can access or create. The nightmares that seem most opposed to healing and growth may actually contain precisely the elements needed for deeper healing and more authentic development. In the days and weeks ahead, I invite you to experiment with a different relationship to any disturbing dreams you experience. Rather than trying to forget them as quickly as possible, record them in detail. Rather than seeing them as meaningless torments, approach them as meaningful communications in symbolic language. Rather than trying to eliminate them through control or suppression, engage with their content through the methods we've discussed: active imagination, drawing, embodiment, dialogue, or ritual. This engagement doesn't guarantee that nightmares will immediately transform or disappear, Integration is a process that unfolds in its own timing, not according to conscious demand or expectation, but conscious relationship with nightmare content creates conditions where transformation becomes possible, where what has appeared as torment can gradually reveal itself as teacher, where what has seemed like meaningless suffering can emerge as purposeful initiation. As you develop this different relationship with your disturbing dreams, you may discover what countless individuals in my practice have found, that the nightmares that seemed most opposed to your well-being actually contained precisely the psychological material you needed for greater wholeness. That the dreams that tormented you were actually invitations to transformation. That the alchemical gold of psychological integration was hidden within what initially appeared as the lead of nightmare suffering. This discovery doesn't eliminate all psychological challenges or create perfect wholeness. Integration is an ongoing process, not a final state to achieve once and for all, but it does transform how you relate to the full range of your psychological experience, including its most disturbing aspects. It opens possibilities for meaning and growth, even in experiences that seem most opposed to them. And it reveals the profound wisdom of the psyche in its natural movement toward wholeness, a movement that includes even our most frightening dreams as part of its purposeful unfolding.